and welcome to ThePrint Softcover, which is an online venue where we launch non-fiction books. And today we'll be discussing Strategic Conundrums, authored by former Ambassador Rajiv Sikri, who we have today with us. This book has been published by Penguin Random House. Ambassador Sikri has had a distinguished career in the Indian Foreign Service spanning 36 years. He retired in 2006 as secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, a role in which he was responsible for India's relations with the Asia Pacific world, the Arab world, Israel, Iran, and Central Asia. He has also served as India's ambassador to Kazakhstan, and he has also held several positions in important capitals across the world like Moscow, New York, Paris, and Kathmandu. He's currently a member of the advisory council of the Vivekananda International Foundation, and he's also the author of Challenge and Strategy Rethinking India's Foreign Policy, that was published in 2009. Ambassador Sikri, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me on your show.
First question: what was the thinking behind the title Strategic Conundrums?
Well, the title was actually suggested by my son, and I mulled over it, and I thought it was a very appropriate one because the world today is in a flux, even more so over the last 2 decades. And it's sometimes difficult to make sense of what is happening. The choices before India, the dilemmas, the challenges before India are quite complex. And there are no easy answers to the foreign policy and security challenges that India is facing today. So there is no straightforward path that can be followed because there are so many players and so many variables that come into play, which is why I thought that conundrums is a good word
Mhm.
because, as I said, there are no easy or simple or straightforward answers.
So it's more that India will have to navigate strategic conundrums on the world stage now, as opposed to if any of the readers and viewers out there were wondering whether our Indian foreign policy brings up conundrums in itself, but it's quite the other. So, in your book, you mentioned that India is a benign or is being viewed as a benign rising power on the world stage for
Yeah.
now, and it has a window of opportunity to secure its due place in the world. Do you feel the Indian government is in need of a clear strategic vision to achieve this?
I think that under Prime Minister Modi, there is a vision. Uh, when the Prime Minister talks about a Viksit Bharat, when he talks about Atmanirbharta, Make in India, I think these are the building blocks and elements that are absolutely essential uh, for India to move forward more decisively and definitively.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, why do first of all, we must have a vision. I mean, if we do not envision ourselves as a great power, we'll never become a great power. So, you must have that. Two, you must recognize what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, how to maximize the strengths and overcome the weaknesses,
Mhm.
and then have a proper strategy, which is not just a government. I think it is a whole of people or whole of country approach that is required, because unless you have everyone involved in it, unless you have people thinking about these issues and coming up with ideas and actually cooperating in realizing a strategic vision, it will not come about.
Mhm.
Take the United States. It sees itself as the indispensable country. It feels it's exceptional. You see China, which also feels that it was the Middle Kingdom and should become the Middle Kingdom. So, what is our vision of ourselves? Are we just content to be low income, middle income country confined to South Asia, or do we see ourselves as playing a greater role in the world because we think that historically we were a great power and civilization. We are today increasingly important, and we think that in the future also, and the rest of the world also thinks that we will be, a very significant player in the world.
So, if I am to understand, you're saying the current government does have a strategic vision, but perhaps certain things could be ironed out a little more
Yeah,
clearer going forward in the long term.
yeah, of course, of course. I think it's there's always a course correction. You have to be flexible. You have to be innovative, imaginative, because there are so many unforeseen events that happen,
Hmm.
and therefore you have to have that agility to change course. You cannot be stuck in one thing, in one rut.
Hmm.
So that's very important, that you have a vision, but then you must be able to be flexible about it.
There's currently a debate also in India about whether we need a national security document, uh, you know, put down in text. There are some schools of thought that say this would be too rigid textualism. They talk about the flexibility that you mentioned that is necessary in a world of flux.
Mm.
Whereas others say, we need a document that can provide direction. What's your view on that?
I am not a great proponent of doctrines and so forth, because you have to live with the real world. Now, take for example our nuclear doctrine.
Hmm.
We say that we will not be the first to use weapons, but if we are attacked, then we will respond with overwhelming force and so forth. Now, it's all right as a doctrine, but in practice, uh, if an emergency situation arises,
Hmm.
the prime minister is not going to say, "Hello, where's the doctrine? What's the doctrine? What should I do?" He will, or she will take a decision based on the overall political situation.
Hmm.
Now, today you're having a conflict in Ukraine, and Russia is saying this is an existential issue for them. They have a nuclear doctrine which says that they will not use nuclear weapons unless the existence of the state is threatened. Now, that judgment of what constitutes the very existence of a state has to be a political one. So,
Hmm.
similarly, to take this example to closer home, I mean, what would be the Indian reaction if, say, a hostile country like China were to try and set up a base in Maldives, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh? I mean, we'd go apoplectic. And, if need be, we would take all the steps to ensure that our security is ensured.
Hmm.
So, security doctrines are okay as a kind of a guideline for those who are in the system to say, okay, this is what we are working towards. But when a decision has to be made, I don't think that people look at doctrines and make decisions. Governments, I
Hmm. Well, in the book, there are 13 chapters, nine of which focus on critical regions and countries on the world stage,
mean.
which are critical to Indian foreign policy. Of course, the neighborhood is something that you write about comprehensively.
Yeah.
There's a particular line that you mentioned in the book about how India's neighbors definitely see it as a sort of a big brother, and while India has had to open its purse strings to its neighbors, uh, they they have not they have been taking their own decisions at times,
Mm.
and you talk about the need for India to be a little more assertive in communicating what non-negotiable security concerns or other concerns it might have with neighbors. Could you expand on that?
Well, the non negotiable security concerns are things like not encouraging or supporting terrorism, uh, or not giving shelter to such groups, not allowing powers that are inimical to India to establish themselves militarily that would threaten our security.
Like
Uh,
the hypothetical base you were talking about.
yeah, like, so that would be, when we sent our IPKF to Sri Lanka, that was part of the thing that, we were thinking that maybe the Americans were going to be there or whatever. And when we went into Bangladesh again, it was a very critical factor. And you will notice that our relations with the countries have improved. Take the case of Bangladesh.
Hmm.
We had very poor relations during Sheikh Khaleda Zia's tenure up to 2006. And because they were encouraging terrorists and doing other, there was Chittagong Arms Hall, if you recall, in 2004. But once the Sheikh Hasina's government took into account our security concerns, then we were far more open to opening up purse strings and
Hmm.
cooperating with them and giving them concessions and so forth. So that is, I think, a critical factor,
Hmm.
that these two or three things, terrorism, bases, uh, you know. Now, we can't do very much if the countries want to get money from other countries like China or the United States or the Arab world, because they also want to develop.
Hmm.
But I think we don't really like it if they fall into a debt trap like Sri Lanka has done and was forced to give Hambantota port. So,
Hmm.
you fall into a debt trap and then you hand over a strategic asset which could become a threat to India. So that's something there we have to be, have an advisory role and say, look, not
Hmm.
really in your interest. Uh, Now, just recently, Sheikh Hasina was here,
Right.
and we agreed that India would develop the Tista Basin waters. Then she went to China. China was also very interested, but she said, "No, we'll go with India." Now, that's the kind of thing, which gives us comfort. That Tista is important to us. It's too close to us. We don't want the Chinese, 100 kilometers or even less from the Indian
Hmm.
border. So when a country, takes into account these sensitivities and interests, that gives us comfort. Whereas, Pakistan says they'll give a Gwadar port or
Hmm.
something like that, or they're letting the Chinese a free run in Pakistan occupied Kashmir and building this
Hmm.
highway. That creates problems for us, and which is why, I mean, I'm sure that our relations with Pakistan would greatly improve if
Hmm.
the Chinese connection with Pakistan were to be much less.
So that's why connectivity is such an important diplomatic tool, which clearly this government in the last 5 to 10 years has focused on that as a tool to also push forward the neighborhood first policy. And Gwadar Port, which you mentioned, is just about 100 kilometers away from Chabahar Port, which
Yeah,
we have invested in
yeah,
Iran. But
yeah,
if I could also come to Russia, since
yeah.
this is also a domain of your expertise, in the book you talk about how India and Russia lack people to people linkages compared to the India US relationship. You also mentioned that India lacks confidence in Russian technological capabilities. Keeping this in mind, how did you view Modi's recent visit to Russia? Do you think it gave the bilateral relationship much needed impetus and relevance?
Oh, I think so. I think that this was a long overdue visit because the tradition of over 2 decades to have an annual summit was broken because of COVID and
The
uh,
war maybe played a role.
yeah, the war, Ukraine war, and so forth. And whereas Prime Minister Modi has been meeting with the Western leaders quite frequently, including at the G7 summit. So I think the idea was to touch base with the Russians, reassure each other that we still matter to the other country. It's an important relationship, And, as I've mentioned, there are so many things which bind us to Russia on the defense side. Now we're getting about 40% of our imported oil from them.
Right.
Russia is very, very rich in raw materials, minerals, uranium, diamonds, other rare earths and metals. And there is good empathy for India in Russia. Now, the problem is that because of the relatively limited people to people contacts, you don't have the numbers of Indians there or Russians here as you do, say, in the West.
Hmm.
The understanding of the changed India and the changed Russia is somewhat weak in both countries. After the Ukraine war, because Russia has been cut off from the West, I think the Russians are beginning to look at India a little more seriously, certainly at the official level. But then
Hmm.
they also have to try and interest their businessmen to do more business with India, to buy from India.
Right.
Uh, Now there is another problem because all the oil that we are buying from them, we're paying in rupees, and it's lots of money accumulated. What do we do? What do the Russians do with that? So they have to either buy or they have to invest in India, whether it's in the stock market or projects or whatever it is. So that requires a huge change in mental approach because these are large sums of money that are
Right.
involved, the tens of billions of dollars. Now, if we can go back to some kind of a renewed or revised ruble rupee arrangement, which we had for many decades, maybe it is the answer. I don't know. I think the two sides understand that this is a problem and are trying to work through it, given the constraints, which is that the private industry in India is a little wary of doing business with Russia because of the possible US secondary sanctions. And most of our companies have a lot of business to do with the United States and the West. So they say, let's be a little careful and so on and so forth. So this is one of the conundrums. How do you tackle that?
Right. If I could also move to your concluding chapter, The Way Forward, where you make a lot of recommendations on Indian foreign policy going
Yeah.
forward. You talk about how Indian foreign policy will be shaped by its own assessment of the changing world order.
Yeah.
In that vein, how do you think a possible return of Donald Trump to the White House will affect India?
Well, we've dealt with Donald Trump earlier, and he has his oddities and so forth. But he's a businessman, and I think we can cut deals with him. Uh, let's not forget that it was Donald Trump in his earlier tenure who initiated and the policy that was going to hurt China, to restrict Chinese access to U.S. and Western technologies. So that's something which makes us a little more comfortable because I think our strategic objective is also to prevent the Chinese from taking over a kind of a global role. The second aspect where I think there could be progress is an end to this Ukraine war, which is hurting everyone. So if there can be a deal, if Mr. Trump becomes the president, that would be in everyone's interest, and hopefully then there can be the moves towards a more normal relationship between Russia and the West and the rest of the world, which is in our interest and that of the global South. Not to speak of Europe itself, because I think that Europe is, I don't know, I find it quite amazing that they are on this path where when the Hungarian Prime Minister talks to Putin, he's demonized. I mean, you can't have a forever war. I mean, diplomacy is is essential to bring any war to a conclusion. So even if like when uh, Hitler was defeated in the Second World War, ultimately It was the peace agreements at the end of the war which led to a stable situation. So you have to talk to Russia sooner or later. And I think the sooner this process begins, the
Hmm.
better it is for Russia, Ukraine, the West, and the whole world. So those are some of the things. But I think Mr. Trump as president again is likely to be a little more not in our favor as far as immigration, H-1B visas, trade dispute, because he's focused on what is good for America, and as you see, he's always having the financial aspect. Why are we giving money to X, Y, or Z? Let the Europeans spend more on their own, stuff like that. So there will be, I think, more freebies on the economic side
Hmm.
for India and for other countries. But I think that we know him. I think Prime Minister Modi gets along with him. After all, he went to Houston. Was it Houston? Yeah, where he talked about the Abki Bar Trump Sarkar kind of thing,
Right.
Um,
He also
so
came to Ahmedabad in
came to
India.
Ahmedabad, and he was very impressed with the reception that he got. So there
Mhm.
is a good background, and let's not forget that. It is with the Republicans that we have achieved many breakthroughs in Indo US relations. George W. Bush and the nuclear deal. Uh, the Republicans, unlike the Democrats, are not into this leftist, woke agenda, human rights, democracy, stuff like that.
Mhm.
Uh, they're a little more pragmatic. They're big businesses with them. So if India is growing and American business sees that there are opportunities in India, they'll say, hello, we want to do business with India. And that makes a difference because then you have got stakeholders in America, powerful stakeholders who have a stake in a
Hmm.
better and closer relationship with India. And that's good for us.
The point you made about Republican presidents historically being good for relations with India was actually touched upon very beautifully by a senior journalist in the US, of course, senior Seema Sirohi. She
Yes, yes,
recently came out with a book called Friends with Benefits.
yes,
Great
I've
title.
read that book. Yeah,
Right. And she actually goes through every president, I think the last 10 or 13 presidents. And it goes to show that Republicans have been good for India in terms of trade, in terms of strategic
yeah.
interests as well. And if any of the viewers are watching, I'd also recommend that book to read, apart from.
No, it's part of, I think it's part of my
Of
selected
course.
bibliography.
Sorry, say that again?
I said, I think it's included in my selected bibliography.
Oh, right. Well, that makes perfect sense. If we could also talk about Europe, since you've spoken about that extensively in your book. You served as secretary in the MEA on specifically on this region.
Yeah.
Do you think a Trump return will undermine uh, the position that Europe currently has on the world stage, which you've mentioned in your book? It might be an economic geopolitical player, but it's not a superpower in any sorts. It is not a strategic geopolitical player of any sorts. Do you see this being further undermined if Trump comes back?
Well, I don't know what he will do, but he's been making statements which seem to imply that NATO is, he's not going to fund NATO and ensure Europe's security. They should pay for it. And the vice president designate or candidate, the new one, JD Vance, is also that this Ukraine war should end. Now,
Hmm.
the Europeans have had a free run for so many years that and they become dependent on it. Now, what is behind the European thinking, I do not know because uh, you know uh, there is a danger for the Europeans that they would be left out in the cold. They, as neighbors of Russia, they have to cut a deal with Russia. You can't sort of pretend that east of Hungary there is a vacuum.
Hmm.
It's just not possible. But today's European leaders, do not seem to think that way. The newly re-elected president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she's a hawk. The new foreign policy chief of Europe, the former prime minister of Estonia, she's an anti-Russian hawk. The Poles are very anti-Russian. All the other Baltic republics are anti-Russian. The only sort of sensible voices coming in are from Hungary and Slovakia. But then you have a situation where the big European countries like Germany, I think the present government's political situation is not very comfortable. And we've seen what has happened in France, where Macron's position has weakened because now it's a three-way thing. And they
Right.
were trying to avoid the far right coming into power. You see what's happened in Britain, where the Labour is in power and we don't know what they're going to do. So I think the Europeans are I don't think they're thinking strategically, which, as I say, is a bit surprising because they have centuries of experience of strategic thinking and relationships and so forth. And now I don't know how they will handle it. But from India's perspective, we have important relations with the European countries. We do think that it would be helpful if Europe, which is an important partner of India, both economically, technologically, and so forth, were to become strategically more independent. Let's see what happens.
Well, Ambassador Sikri, thank you for taking the time out to speak to the print about this very intriguing book that I heartily recommend to our viewers and subscribers. Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to us.
Thank you, Pia. Thank you for having me on your show.